Plugin of the week is the Empirical Labs Arousor. The Arousor is about as close as you're ever going to get to an emulation, a complete emulation that really embodies all of the characteristics, sonic characteristics, and sound of the distressor. While Empirical Labs doesn't call this an exact emulation because it adds a whole number of extra features which are very cool, it definitely captures the characteristic sound. If you're not familiar with the distressor was a hardware unit that was created in the mid-90s by Dave Durr and heavily influenced by compressors like the 1176, LA2A, and a lesser-known one by Valley people called Gainbrain. These hardware pieces exhibited unique attack characteristics, the shape of the attack, which Dave was particularly interested in, and that's a big part of what made the distressor so successful in the marketplace, particularly in an era where everything was shifting towards digital, and here was this amazing compressor that would actually give you a warming characteristic that was very analog in nature. Essentially, if you look at the compressor itself, it very much embodies an 1176 design. Has a fixed threshold, so you drive the input gain to give yourself gain reduction. So you're just basically pushing the input level through a fixed threshold. You have an attack, a release setting, and then you have an output gain which you can use to match the output, and you have a ratio control. So that as a basic layout gives you more or less an 1176 style design, although it's not a specific emulation of that. You see gain reduction along the top here and a bad clip LED, which indicates when you were 0.5 dB away from 0 dBFS. Internally, there's more than enough headroom to go above 0 dBFS, but it's just about what happens down the line. So if you see that, you can pull back your output gain to kind of balance out whatever it is that you're doing. Some additional features that were added in. One is a 1.5 to 1 and 2 to 1 ratio, which is different from the hardware unit. Otherwise, the ratios remain the same. If you're familiar with the hardware unit, you'll see that the rivet setting here replaces what was called the nuke setting on the hardware unit. There's also an attack modification. So what this does is it helps to change the shape of the attack. And this is part of what makes this such a musical sounding compressor, very analog sounding. So we'll play around a little bit with that. You can turn it off, and that'll give you more of a digital straight-on characteristic. It comes at a default setting of 2 there. You can see with the blue dot, and then you can drive it upwards. There's also a meter to give you an indication of how much the attack is being modified. There's also a soft clipping section. So on the distressor unit, there were actually 2 additional settings, distortion 2 and distortion 3, excuse me. And while this doesn't necessarily directly emulate those exact settings, it actually gives you something that's better. It gives you a default setting of 4. You can have less saturation or more saturation, and it also gives you an indication of what's going on, basically how much you're saturating. So you see a meter there. The effective design is more or less to just kind of provide a soft clipping, like an analog warming effect on the audio signals. This is really important stuff, especially in DAWs. So it's a really cool feature, and you'll end up using this a lot. There's also a detector circuit, as many compressors have. It has a high-pass filter for the detection sidechain and also a full parametric EQ. So what this allows you to do is, for example, if you wanted to use this as a de-esser, you could dial in a sibilance frequency, filter off the low frequencies, boost the crap out of it, and then use that to drive the attack and release and gain reduction. So you could use it effectively that way if you wanted to. Another way, it's maybe more in lines with the way that you would use it. Say you had it on a drum loop, and for example, maybe the kick drum is not driving the gain reduction as much as the snare is. You could just dial in a lower frequency and boost that up and kind of get it so that the kick and the snare kind of drive the compression a little bit easily. So having that full parametric there is far more helpful than just having a high-pass, low-pass filter, so it's a great addition. You also have a wet-dry control here on the mix. What's cool here, if you click on the E, what you get is the ability to add or take away the dry level, which works relative to the mix control. So this allows you to drive in or add in more dry signal as a way, another additional way of working with the blend. This actually can kind of come in handy if a straight, wet, dry, where you want perhaps more of a send return kind of configuration where you can mix in the amount of distortion or compression. And in addition to the dry signal, this would give you some way to kind of create a similar type of scenario. One final thing here, there's a little help indicator down at the bottom. So you click on there, it gives you some basic instructions, access to the online manual, which is always good to read, and the Empirical Labs website. So all of that stuff is there. So let's dive in. I have this set up on the mix bus just initially, and I'll show you a couple of other things, ways that you can use it. So what I have here is just the standard 4:1 ratio. Now, there's a couple things. This is V2. This is revision 2, and it uses 1/3 the CPU power of the previous version, so that'll be a bonus on that side. And if you're very familiar with the hardware unit, you might find that if you're looking for, say, a 4:1 ratio, you might find yourself gravitating more towards 6:1. And if you like 6:1, you might be gravitating more towards 8:1. This is something that's indicated in the manual. I haven't found this particularly to be the case, but I don't have a distressor unit by my side all the time. So maybe if you're a person who has that right there and now you're bringing it into the DAW, that's just something that you find, so be aware of that. So let's start just with a kind of standard setup here. Mix bus, 30 millisecond attack, 116 millisecond release, which just happens to be a 16th note release time, and a couple dB gain reduction just to kind of pump the mix a little bit. And let's just kind of have a listen to that at a 4:1 ratio. So I'll start with it bypassed and bring it in after a couple bars.
Been around the corner, man, I've been around the corner trying to make it around the world. Where you going? Hey, tell me where you headed, where you going, man, I've been around the corner. Nah, man, I've been around the corner trying to make it around the world. Where you headed? Hey, tell me where you going, we gon' take it around the world now. Hey, we gon' take it around the whole entire world. Hey, we gon' take it around the world.
So one thing I noticed here just quickly is that the snare drum on the backbeat is not really triggering as much. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to push here a mid-range frequency, maybe like 2K or so, add a little bit of that in and see if I can get the snare to kind of trigger a little bit more consistently with the kick drum for the gain reduction. I'm also going to back off on it a little bit, make it a little bit lighter. Alternatively, I could have also filtered off some of the low end and driven a little bit more into it, but this basically works. So you get a good idea of just how this sounds just straight out on the mix bus. And this is a very VCA style usage. Essentially, this is a VCA feedback style VCA compressor setup. And, you know, this just kind of gives you like a good fundamental thing. If you wanted to do something a little bit lighter, you could switch to a 2:1 ratio. I'll toggle around to a couple of the ratios just so you can kind of get a sense of what this is all about. As I start to go up into the higher ratios, I can set the attack modification. So you can see how much more it's going in there. But what this does is it allows you to preserve more of the transient while driving a more aggressive compression. And you could start to see how it really starts to warm up and kind of clamp down on the mix. Let's take a look at a couple of things here. One, I can kind of focus on something here that's a little bit more specific just to the drums. So I'll take this out for a second off of the mix bus. And so what I have here is something along the lines of what I was doing here, where I have the rivet setting here and a faster attack, and I guess this would be about an 1/8 note release timing. And we're going to drive a fair amount of gain reduction here, but what's happening is I have the attack modification up almost all of the way to help kind of push a bit more, kind of allow that transient to go through while being very aggressive. I also have some saturation in here, so we can get a sense for this, maybe dial in a little bit of a sound and see if we can blend it in with the mix control. Just so you can hear what it's like without. Again, I'm having a similar type of thing here. So you can see how you can really dig into this and how it will just take that all in. And this attack modification feature is just incredible for this. There's so many uses for that because it allows you to be super aggressive without just completely choking down the attack. It's also cool because with the setup here, we can also blend this back to do a little wet-dry control on it. So you can see how just those simple features alone just give you a lot of creative control that you can kind of mix in. This is also, it's very cool for lots of other things here. I can actually, take this out. I have this on the bass sound. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just kind of bypass this here for a second just so you can kind of hear this. Another way of using this, like on this particular sound, I have a bass that's like really super low end, and so it needs a bit of distortion in it or a bit of grit in it so that it will kind of cut through in the mix. And those low frequencies, you'll be able to image them so that they don't clog up the mix and make everything super muddy. So what I have here is a very light ratio, super fast attack, so 0.05 milliseconds, so 50 microseconds. And then 50 millisecond attacks. That's going to be the fastest, release setting. So I'm going to drive, about 3-4 dB of gain reduction in here with the lighter ratio. And what this is going to do is going to give it just a little bit of bite. It's going to create a lot of super fast movement. But because I'm driving this in pretty well, it's going to, kind of eat into the sound a little bit and create a little bit of movement. So have a listen. You'll kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. And you can see how it adds just an incredible clarity. And then you can mix that back if it's a little bit much. You could also drive a bit of distortion in here, or saturation. So you can see just that alone gives you a lot of amazing control. Sometimes with this you can actually go more aggressive by taking away the attack modification. So anyway, just a little bit of an aside. There's also another thing, you can use this distortion. It's really handy for doing stuff like taking, for example, a snare sound and let's see here. Oops, hold on. It looks like I Mix that up. Okay, this is just on the snare sound, so I think I have that soloed up here. Let's see. And what I have here is just like a rivet setting, and then I'm pushing that attack modification off, so I get a lot of gain reduction here, but I'm just saturating it to kind of give it a bit more of an edgy sound or a character, also warming it up. And if I want more attack, I can push this up higher. Otherwise, it'll just eat up that attack entirely. So there's a lot of creative ways that you can use this for kick drum, for bass, for vocals, to add grit. This is like when you start digging into this, you'll just instantly fall in love with it. It's an amazing emulation. The hardware unit is just, a must-have for every studio. So having this emulated so well with all these additional features and flexibilities makes it a must-have plugin, absolutely. So, all right, there you have it. That's a plugin of the week by Empirical Labs. It's the Arousor.